Okay friends, it's time to do a book review. I just read the book Sapiens by Yuval Harari, and I felt like the book was pretty good. It covered basically all of human history, and it made it digestible into 400 pages, and it was pretty engaging. I want to put the disclaimer out that I don't necessarily agree with all of it, and some of the points and conclusions it makes. At the very least, if you pick this book up, it'll be thought-provoking. It's about 400 pages long. It's very dense with lots of coverage, and it basically tries to throw the last 200,000 years into 400 pages. I tried to make a short synopsis of this book, and it ended up being, about 30 pages. And because I don't want to make this an hour-long presentation, I'm going to try and stick to the most compelling points in the book and the biggest takeaways, as well as what I found most insightful about it. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to say that once again, I don't agree with everything in the book, but like I said, it's very thought-provoking in the very least, so I highly recommend you at least pick this up. 70,000 years ago, we had the cognitive revolution. We developed language, abstract thinking, enabling complex societies, shared myths, and cooperation beyond small groups. Highlight how, and as you can see, Grok is sprinkling in elements of video stuff, which is always kind of cute because Grok likes to try to go above and beyond. So the most important thing I want to highlight is this again, Grok and ChatGPT tend to over-summarize everything, right? But it's only going to give you maybe 2 paragraphs at most, right? And it's trying to throw the entire book into 2 paragraphs, and that's just not possible, right? So in the book, it goes over for a very long period of time shared myths. When we have shared myths, common ideas, even if they don't make sense or they're stupid, as long as the 2 parties believe in them at the same time, they can conduct themselves, we'll say. So what's like a shared myth? There's quite a few things that they use, such as the idea of government, religion, the common myth of empires, and other things, but the most important one that the book goes over is the idea of money. You can have 2 strangers who have nothing to do with each other, have never met each other, know nothing about each other, and they can conduct themselves in a way that's civil because they both believe in the idea of money. For example, one guy goes to Home Depot, well, I don't know Bob. Bob doesn't know anything about me, but I know Bob has a hammer. And I need the hammer, and Bob doesn't know that I need the hammer necessarily, but I'm going to tell him I need the hammer, and in turn, I'm going to give him this green piece of paper, and all of a sudden, he's just going to let me do it because the piece of paper says it's worth this many dollars or bills or items or whatever it says, right? So because we have shared myths, it makes us so much stronger than chimpanzees, because the book says that we're about the same with chimpanzees, more or less at about 150 people, but once we start getting into bigger and bigger groups of about 1,000 plus populations, we start to really differ because we can still tend to work together, right? The book uses the analogy of if you have Wall Street and you have 1,000 chimpanzees running around on Wall Street, are they really going to be able to participate with each other, or will it be total mayhem? It'll be total mayhem. Whereas humans can gather in Tiananmen Square or wherever, and for the most part conduct themselves civilly. And it's ironic that the book used the CCP's Tiananmen Square example, right? So this is a very recent change as of 12,000 years ago. The agricultural revolution. Shift from foraging to farming created a surplus of food and leading to cities, writing, and hierarchies, which were all not really possible when we were living in the 150-person tribe groups. And once again, it goes over this. It's only giving me one sentence here, which I find fascinating, but there's some huge trade-offs that we have with the agricultural revolution, right? So when we're hunter-gatherers and we have an invading tribe or an invading neighboring territory of people or whatever, and they're coming into our territory rather, what is the worst that happens? You have fight or flight, right? So you can either sit there and fight them, or you can run away. Now, if you run away and you're in the hunter-gatherer era, what do you have to yourself? Well, you don't really own any land. You're kind of foraging anyway, so you're not really losing much by running away, right? In turn, though, if you have the agrarian society, now you have a shitload more on the line to lose if you don't stay and fight, right? If you have giant granaries, and you have structures where people live and dwellings like that, and you have farm animals and such, and then you have your personal belongings in your home because that's been your home, now you can lose all that stuff. Whereas if you're a hunter-gatherer, you don't even have that, so you have nothing to lose by running away, basically. So the agricultural revolution, of course, makes it more stable for us to get our food. But realistically, the argument in the book is that it's much worse for us. Because rather than working a few hours a day to go get a few animals or something and kill them and bring them back and cook them, now we're plowing fields all day from sun up to sundown, more or less, and there's never enough. You can never have enough food in your granary because now you're subject to bad seasons, right? What happens if one year you have a really great season and then you have all this food and you eat it all, right? And then the next season's terrible and then you stocked up nothing for the next season. Well, you screwed yourself. Now you're gonna all die from starvation because you have no food because you didn't prepare. In the hunter-gatherer world, that wasn't really a thing, but in the agricultural revolution, now you're always preparing for the next inevitable drought or failure of crops in the coming years in the future. And there's uncertain. You don't know when that's going to happen. You could have 4 bad years in a row of droughts and bad crops, and that could really screw you because if you only prepare for 2 years, well, there's going to be 2 years of poverty and squalor and starvation. And to summarize that all, the second key point of the book basically is the agricultural revolution certainly enlarged the sum of total food at the disposal of humankind, but the extra food didn't translate into a better diet or more leisure. Rather, it translated into population explosions and pampered elites. The average farmer would work harder than the average forager, as I discussed, and got a worse diet in return. The agricultural revolution, as the book claims, was history's biggest fraud. So that's one of the other points that I didn't mention, is the agricultural revolution gave us a worse diet. Now we're eating grains and only such throughout lots of history, whereas previously we had been eating lots of protein through meat and plant stuff, but switching to all grain just doesn't necessarily give us a better trade-off, right? So now we get to the scientific revolution, which is the last 500 years, and this is really where we start talking about modern history and how things have changed so much. The book calls the scientific revolution really the revolution of ignorance and how we stopped believing that we knew everything and were willing to test things. Emphasis on evidence and experimentation drove technological leaps from steam engines to AI. Harari argues that this gave humans unprecedented power but raised ethical dilemmas. Basically, it talks at length that when we start going through the scientific revolution, one of the biggest advantages that you can have is if you understand more things and can create better technology than your opponents or competitors, then you can go ahead and colonize them. So in the last 500 years, there's been a lot of colonization and taking over other cultures, right? When the Spanish came to South America and North America, their technology was far superior to than that of the natives, and they easily overtook their lands. Of course, disease was really more of the bigger factor than that. But having better technology and having that advantage allows you to overtake their culture and then insert your culture into theirs in place of it. And within a generation or two, which the book talks about, those people's culture are forgotten and they accumulate to the new culture, and that's that. So it's also really important because the book talks about arms racing in this sense, right? Because we've learned through history, you can't let your opponent have a better technological advantage, and then your people and population will be accumulated into the culture that's taking you over. And within 2 or 3 generations, your culture dies because the new culture overtook your population. And definitely one of the cooler aspects at the end of the book is in the future, Harari explores humanity's trajectory, biotech, AI, potential superhumans could redefine our species, the ethical questions that are defined by that, questions whether progress equals happiness, and definitely there's a lot of happiness talk at the end of the book that I want to go over a little bit more in detail. And we can actually do that here. Harari argues that despite technological and societal advancements, humans are not necessarily happier than our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Happiness is relative, shaped by expectations and social comparisons rather than absolute conditions and what's available at the time, right? For example, modern conveniences like electricity and medicine haven't guaranteed emotional fulfillment because our desires scale with progress. New comforts create new frustrations. Very true. He suggests that happiness depends on aligning expectations with reality and finding meaning, not just material gains. Biologically, our brains are still wired for survival, not constant contentment, so chasing happiness through external achievements often falls short. The book uses an awesome analogy talking about how hunter-gatherers were probably not all that much more dissatisfied than we are. Hunter-gatherers and people in medieval France would have actually been more content with their lives than we are today. Why? Because our expectations of life are so much higher, and the things we can get are better. They didn't have Ferraris, they didn't have spaceships, they didn't have OnlyFans, they didn't have all these things that give us supreme rushes of dopamine in the moment. All they had back then was, hey, my mud hut is built and I'm friggin' happy about it, right? And I'm very content that the weather and saber-tooth tigers are not entering my home anymore. So that for them, they were probably happier than we are today, right? Because when you win the lottery and you win a shitload of money like that, you really feel all that much happier 2 or 3 weeks later? Yeah, I guess you would, right? But not so much, right? And he also talks about the genetic aspect of happiness. It's likely that 2 parents who have a kid give that kid a certain happiness O-meter, right? And genetically, maybe he could only ever hit like an 8 out of 10, whereas another kid could hit a 10 out of 10, and the difference could be genetic, right? Of course, this is very explosive stuff, and that has to do a lot with like racial and species-type genetics. And that's a conversation that people don't want to have because it's too sensitive. But hey, that's the reality, right? And there's been plenty of things that have been sensitive throughout history as well, right? And this was one of the more awesome analogies in the book. Harari uses a fictional example of a 17th century merchant father who has 2 sons illustrate the rise of capitalism and credit. And the book does quite extensively talk a lot about credit. The father, a wealthy Amsterdam merchant, sends one son to trade spices in Spain and another in Holland. The son needs loans to fund their ventures, and banks, trusting the growing economy, provide credit based on future profits, not just existing wealth. The story shows how capitalism relies on optimism about growth, unlike earlier economies where wealth was static. The takeaway is that credit fueled by the belief in progress transformed trade and society, enabling massive economy expansions, but also risk if the son's ventures fail. Grok's not exactly telling it the way that I want it to, but basically the analogy in Spain talks about how the king is funding wars and going to war and burning all this money very, very quickly. So when the king learns that the son has 10,000 gold coins available through his father, the king takes the 10,000 coins and uses it for war. Once the king starts running out of money again, then he asks for another 10,000, and then again he needs another 20,000 after that. And he threatens to throw the son in jail if the king doesn't get the 20,000, right? Of course, the courts are not going to defy the king because the courts are terrified of the king himself, who's a despot at that point. And so what happens is, now that everyone's learned that, hey, you have to give us money or go to jail in Spain, people start smuggling their money out of the country. Where else do we see this in the world right now? Well, China, right? You want to get your money out if you can, because, well, they can don't you love how people always say nationalize things? The government can nationalize your property, right? Ooh, national. It's kind of like George Carlin said, right? It's almost kind of like this nice, friendly word of nationalize. Sounds like a pleasant experience, right? No, someone's taking your shit that you earned, and they're going to go spend it on whatever the hell they want at the expense of you and your time and your labor. So the other part of the analogy is the son that does things in Holland. The other son in Holland spends the $10,000, and one of the guys screws him in Holland, but because the courts are based on private property merit and respecting those rights, they place a lien on the person who screwed him, and eventually that money comes back to the son. They're able to pay off the loans with interest and have a nice shoe shop or whatever. So the point that I'm making is the respect, and the book does this a few times where it goes over these kind of huge takeaways, but it says it in like maybe a sentence or two, and it just glosses over it very quickly. So if you're not paying attention, it could be very easy to miss this. But if you don't respect private property rights, especially as a society, you just take whatever the hell you want, what does that signal? It signals that people need to get out because private property is not respected. So when you're in Holland, the nice short-term gain is to take people's money, right? But for the long term, with growth and trust, and to make sure that other people trust each other in that economy so that growth can continue, you have to respect people's private property rights, regardless of how nice the fix of short-term money might feel, you know? So interesting, Harari doesn't explicitly present a chart, but he discusses the inverse relationship between state power and family structures. It does give the chart, and I'll show it to you here in a sec. In societies with weak governments, tribal or feudal, families and kinship networks are strong, acting as the primary source of support, protection, and identity. For example, in medieval Europe, clans handled disputes and welfare. As governments grow stronger, modern nation states, they take over the roles like education, healthcare, justice, weakening family ties. Centralized states demand loyalty to the nation over kin, and urbanization further fragments extended families. This shift offers stability but can erode community bonds. Okay, and this is the chart that I was talking about in the book. And basically it says that the pre-modern cycle is the strong family and community lead to a weak state and market because the family and community are already taken over that role. So in turn, that means we have weak individuals, and when we have weak individuals, we have strong family and community, right? Don't necessarily know if I agree with this wholeheartedly, but the first two bubbles of strong family and community leading to a weak state and market, I would agree with that. So the modern cycle now is the inverse. The weak family and community lead to a strong state and market, right? Because it's replacing the idea and the goal of what families and societies and communities used to have. This leads to strong individuals, and when we have strong individuals, we have weak family and community. That's not necessarily true. I wouldn't agree with that. In order to really break the power of the family and community, they need help from the fifth column. The state and the market approached people with an offer they couldn't refuse. And become individuals, they said. Marry whomever you want without asking permission from your parents. Take up whatever job suits you, even if the elders frown upon it. Live wherever you wish, even if you cannot make it every week to family dinner. You are no longer dependent on your family or your community. We, the state and the market, will take care of you instead. We will provide food, shelter, education, health, welfare, and employment. We will provide pensions, insurance, and protection. That is where we are today. The government has tried to take it over. We see it totally. If a woman makes a bad choice and she has a kid out of wedlock, the kid gets raised by, well, guess what? The government and all the money that gives the women, right? So it endorses those choices. At length, the book talks about modern specialization and like the hunter-gatherers, right? So in today's society, we have extreme specialization, right? So because we're all intertwined and we're all connected at this point in our society, we really don't have to know very much to get by in the world, right? Overall, people in the hunter-gatherer age knew mostly the same stuff. They could sneak up on things very quickly and quietly. They were experts. They had extreme conditioning, and they knew their local territory pretty well, right? You could survive outside. Of course, they didn't know anything about medicine, and if you get cut, an infection was death usually. But overall, they had the same sense of knowledge, even if it wasn't very much. They all had very, very basic stuff, right? So they were all the same basic kind of prototype of people that knew certain things, right? Today, outside of the basic circle of knowledge, we have extreme specialization, right? So if you have an accountant today who's over here, he's going to know tons and tons about this tiny little field of accounting and law, right? But you ask him about how biochemical engineering works, and he's not going to know shit. You ask him how to go hunt in the woods, he's probably not going to know shit, especially if he's in a giant urban area, right? In Texas, this is different. People actually do go hunting and fishing, even if they're accountants sometimes. But for example, in Los Angeles, yeah, right. So people have very limited knowledge in what they have, but what they have is a specialized, compartmentalized sort of like specialization of knowledge. So in turn, does this make us better or worse? Well, we're just trading off, right? Now we don't need to know shit because someone else is doing the other thing for us because we're part of a larger society. But at the same time, if let's just say that, a super virus took over and coronavirus, let's just say the coronavirus killed everyone, well, we're probably screwed because we need other people desperately to help us at least achieve the basics. And those basics just simply aren't available. It's too specialized it's too generalized of knowledge, and we just aren't prepared for that, So specialization drives efficiency and innovation, allows deep expertise leading to breakthroughs like vaccines and skyscrapers, division of labor, supports complex societies, enabling trade and technological progress. For example, a modern surgeon can save lives a hunter-gatherer couldn't. Cons: specialization narrows skills, making individuals dependent on systems. You can't hunt or build your own houses, generally true. It can lead to alienation as work feels disconnected from survival and like varied tasks of hunter-gatherers, hunting, foraging, and crafting. Modern jobs often lack the autonomy and variety of ancestral life, potentially reducing fulfillment. Very true, because when you're in an office job, let's say you're doing accounting or doing engineering, do you really feel like you're making that much of an impact on society? Probably not, right? Sometimes you will, there's exceptions, but generally, if you're doing an office job, just whatever it might be, you don't really feel like you're helping all that much because you're kind of just doing BS work, Hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They were generous, skilled in multiple survival tasks, giving them independence and adaptability. However, their knowledge was limited by oral tradition, and life was riskier without modern medicine and tools. That's one thing I guess I haven't talked about yet, is the whole concept of oral and writing and technology like that, right? So when you had hunter-gatherers, why weren't they ever writing anything down, right? Well, if you have these groups of 150 people at most, and it's probably like 100 or 75, right? You don't need to write things down because everyone talks to everyone, and everyone's very, very in touch and in tune with their community. So why would you write down what you already know, and people will always pass on orally to the next generation? But, don't forget, that doesn't mean they're stupid. That just means they're all very much in sync with the connection that they all have, right? In these super cities and super places with these massive populations, right? You really don't have that much in common with another guy, kind of like I told you about in the money analogy, right? So for that purpose, to make sure that you have the same values, it's easier to write things down, and writing becomes a useful technology to convey that. That's just one purpose of writing, that's not all of it, but that's like the general gist, right? So Grok's not talking about this in the exact light I want to either, but basically it goes through an analogy where the Egyptian president hires someone who's like a psychic or a seer to predict the future, and the future guy predicts that there will be a revolution that could take over and kill the president, right? So the president, what does he do? He takes preventative measures. He lowers taxes. He gives lots of money away in terms of welfare and such like that, so the people will be satisfied, right? Well, because he took those preventative measures, now the people don't rebel, right? So there's no rebellion, and the president's like, dude, what the fuck is your problem? There's no rebellion. You screwed me out of this money that I could have built for my palace. So the president's very dissatisfied with this person, who, even though the person prevented the revolution, if the president might not even know that, right? So as humans, that's what we have. We have this kind of problem where we only see, there's like the seen and unseen, right? So you only see what's in front of you, right? And the president only saw that there was no revolution, so he thinks the guy's a fake, even though he did prevent the revolution. It's unseen, right? If you kind of like the seen and unseen, The Black Swan's a pretty good book. It talks a lot about the unseen and like the cemetery of ideas where you just have no idea what survived. You can only see what's in front of you. But this is a fascinating concept, and I like the way that the book talks about it through this analogy. So there's 2 points I think that are worth mentioning. One I've already touched on, basically, where writing was sparsely used. Think about how society lived. It was mostly oral, and also when someone died, the knowledge they had died with them, right? And that's the greatest thing about books. You can continue to pass things on generationally without having to do it orally, and it's from the original source most of the time, right? So one of the key points, again, this book does not talk much about Republicans and Democrats at all in like those political terms, but it does say a few things here and there. One of the things is Democrats want a more equitable society, even if it means raising taxes to fund programs to help the poor, elderly, and infirm. That infringes on the freedom of the individuals to spend their money as they wish. Why should the government force me to buy health insurance if I prefer using my money to put my kids through college? Republicans, on the other hand, want to maximize individual freedom, even if it means the income gap between the rich and poor will grow wider, and that many Americans will not be able to afford health care. When it puts it into terms like this, it seems so obvious to those of us who are actually paying attention to things. But you have to remember, most of us who are watching this on BitChute are politically in tune with how things are, right? So this seems like a very obvious statement, right? But how many people who are on the collective side of things, the socialist side, who want to vote Democrat, who voted for Kamala Harris even though they saw the whole shebang unfold with Joe Biden, right? How many of those people could even put it in those terms and they understand enough that that's the dilemma? Most of the time it's just you people are bad and therefore you don't want to help the poor and you're just a bad person, right? That's like how dumb the argument is, right? They completely miss the whole side of the right, which is the individualized aspect of it. Like, no, I don't want to spend my money on that because I want to spend the money that I have on the way that on things that I want to spend it on. And you infringing on my freedom is actually a violation of my rights. So again, this is just one sentence from the book, but I think it does a good job of putting that. And going a little further, it does talk about socialists in another part of the book. According to socialists, inequality is the worst blasphemy against the sanctity of humanity because it privileges peripheral qualities of humans over their universal essence. And that's true. The left sees the inequality as the biggest blasphemy of humankind, right? So do you think that you could tell the previous section of that book to a socialist and they'll understand that? No, because the greatest blasphemy of socialists is inequality. How dare we be unequal? We need to all be equal, right? Equally poor and broke and going to death camps, you know? Another awesome aspect of the book is that this is one of the distinguishing marks of as an academic discipline. The better you know a particular historical period, the harder it becomes to explain things why it happened, one way and not another. Those who only have superficial knowledge of a certain period tend to focus only on the possibility that it was eventually realized. They offer a just-so story to explain the hindsight why that outcome was inevitable. Those more deeply informed about the period are much more cognizant of the roads not taken. In fact, people who knew the period the best, those alive at the time, were the most clueless of all. For the average Roman in Constantine's time, the future was a fog. It was an iron rule of history that what looks inevitable in hindsight was far from obvious at the time. Today is no different. Are we out of the global economic crisis, or is the worst still to come? Will China continue growing until it becomes a leading superpower? Will the United States lose its hegemony? Is the upsurge of monotheistic fundamentalism the wave of the future, or the local whirlpool of little long-term significance? Are we heading towards ecological disaster or technological paradise? There's good arguments to be made, but no way of knowing for sure. In a few decades, and this is the worst part and the most criminal thing for the most clueless people, in a few decades, people will look back and think the answers to these questions were all obvious. Fucking what? And it's true. People will be like, of course Trump got elected the first time, Biden got elected next, and then Trump got elected the next time. Of course that was inevitable. Huh? Of course Russia was always going to invade Ukraine. People just tend to think that history is extremely simple and you can just explain things super simply. One more point the book makes is, over the last few years, banks and governments have been frenziedly printing money. Everybody's terrified that the current economic crisis may stop the growth of the economy. So they're creating trillions of dollars, euros, and yen out of thin air, pumping cheap credit into the system, hoping that scientists, technicians, and engineers will manage to come up with something really big before the bubble bursts. Everything depends on the people in the labs. New discoveries in fields such as biotech, nanotech can create entire new industries whose profits could back the trillions of make-believe money that the banks and governments have created since 2008. If the labs do not fulfill these expectations before the bubble bursts, we're heading towards very rough times. Okay, this is a really, really nice and friendly and good way of looking at it, which is like, ooh, man, these banks and governments are really looking at things like very positively, right? What we actually know is happening is, oh shit, we're overspending. We can't fucking control ourselves, so what we're going to do is print and counterfeit the currency and screw the population at the time because we don't know what the hell to do other than go to war, give out shitloads of welfare, and promise all these benefits to keep us in power, but we can't do it unless we print because the money that we're required to do all these things is just impossible to raise from taxes alone. One note is, the book does talk quite a lot about France at some points, but something I found fascinating was a point I just want to touch on was eventually in the 1780s, King Louis XVI, who had ascended to the throne on his grandfather's death, realized half his annual budget was tied to servicing interest on his loans and that he was heading towards bankruptcy. Does this sound like anything familiar that we might know about here in the United States? Yeah. One other kind of cool note is if you were an 18-year-old youth in the small village 5,000 years ago, you'd think you were pretty good looking because guess what? There's only 50 other men in your village, and most of them are either old, scarred, wrinkled, or little kids. But if you're a teenager today, you're more likely to feel inadequate because even if other guys at school are an ugly lot, you don't measure yourself against the ugly fucks, but against the movie stars, athletes, and supermodels vision Facebook and giant billboards, right? This is very true. Comparatively, you were probably good looking just by being healthy and in shape back then during your youth. But today, because we have such extreme standards, you're more likely to feel like, ah, shit, right? I remember I felt during my teenage years like, ah, shit, I'm pretty ugly, right? And it's like, guess what, bitch? Fucking no. But then you come to reality and you realize that most people don't work out. And most people don't even move continuously for like 10 minutes at any point during the day, at least in the United States. Okay, well, that was Sapiens. It was a fun book to read. I enjoyed many aspects of it. It definitely was profound and thought-provoking. Once again, I don't agree with everything. I skipped over a lot of things by going over this. As you can see on my Google Doc, I had 30 pages of notes, and I probably only went over maybe a page and a half of the highlights at most. So if you can read this book, definitely recommend it. It's pretty good. If you enjoy this, leave a comment and subscribe. Let me know what other book you would want me to do, or if you have other book recommendations for topics like this, let me know, and I'll try to see what I can do. Until then, take care.